Hey guys, tonight, a woman looking for a house in the wrong state. She is looking for a one-room cabin her father built when she was 2 years old, on open grass, and she has brought her grown daughter along to help her find it. They search in Oklahoma. The house was in Kansas, about 13 miles from a town called Independence, and they never do find it. Her name is Laura Ingalls Wilder. She is in Oklahoma because she had written down, in her own hand, that the family lived 40 miles from Independence. 40 miles puts you over the state line. She trusted her own page, and her own page was wrong. Settle in, get comfortable. This one takes a while. Here is what stopped me when I started pulling the records. There was never one little house. Between the day Caroline Quiner married Charles Ingalls and the day she died, she set up a household under 18 separate roofs, in 5 states and 1 territory, and she lost or left every one of them but the last. Cabins, a dugout in a creek bank, rooms over a grocery, a hotel with a saloon underneath it, a shanty on a claim, a wagon, more than once, for weeks at a time. The books turn that into wandering. Pa gets restless, the country fills up, and off they go with the fiddle in the wagon box. Lovely story. Not what the paper says. The paper says debt. It says a sheriff. It says land they had no legal right to stand on, land they paid double for, and one farm sold at a loss 3 days after they finished buying it. And Caroline was there for the signing, not waiting at home. In person, in front of a justice of the peace, putting her name on the same documents. So tonight, we walk them in order, the way she unpacked them. By the end, you will know which one she got to keep and how old she was. If these quiet nights are worth something to you, subscribe. Then tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what the clock says where you are. Our 3 little books live at prairiesecrets.com. On a television, scan the code on your screen. On a phone, the links are in the description and the pinned comment. Thank you for being here. And if you fall asleep somewhere in Wisconsin, that's fine. I'll keep watch. One housekeeping note before we start, because somebody always checks. I am counting the roof she unpacked under, not the address. The Wisconsin cabin counts twice, because she moved into it twice, years apart, with 2 other states in between. So where does a life like that start losing? The first house Caroline lost, she lost 11 months after her wedding. They were married on the 1st of February, 1860, in Concord Township, Jefferson County, Wisconsin. She was 20, he was 24. And instead of setting up on their own, they moved in with his parents. We know that because the census taker came through that summer and wrote them down. Charles and Caroline Ingalls, in the household of Lansford and Laura Ingalls, along with Charles's unmarried brothers and sisters, a newly married couple in somebody else's kitchen, on somebody else's 80 acres, beside the Oconomowoc River. Now, that arrangement was not supposed to be permanent, and it was not supposed to be charity either, because Charles already owned part of that farm. 3 years earlier, in November of 1857, he had bought the East 40 acres from his own father. He paid $460 for it. Sit with that number for a second, because it explains a great deal about the next 40 years. Lansford Ingalls had bought the entire 80 acres, all of it, on the last day of 1853 for $300. 4 years later, his son paid $460 for half of it. That is not a family being cheated. That is the price of Wisconsin land in the 1850s, doing what land prices do right before they stop. Everybody was buying. Everybody was borrowing to buy, and the young men buying at the top were the ones holding the note when it turned. It turned. The taxes went unpaid. There was a mortgage, and it went unpaid too, and somebody sued both Ingalls men over it, father and son together, and then the sheriff came and sold the farm. All 80 acres went for $700. Charles had paid $460 for 40 of them. Caroline had been a married woman for less than a year. There were no children yet. Mary would not be born for another 4 years. The whole household lost it at once. The parents' half and their own half, in one sale, to one buyer. That is where this starts. Not with restlessness, with a sheriff. So why does a woman of 20 absorb that without, as far as anyone ever recorded, one word of complaint? Because she had seen the whole thing before, in a different family, when she was 5 years old. And here is why she would have understood exactly what she was looking at, better than her husband did. Caroline Lake Quiner was born in a log cabin in the town of Brookfield on the 12th of December 1839. Brookfield was in Milwaukee County then. Waukesha County was cut out of it 7 years later. Her parents had bought the ground 5 weeks before she arrived. 80 acres, entered directly from the United States government at the legal minimum price, $1.25 an acre, $100 for the whole thing. She was, as far as anybody has been able to establish, the first settler's child ever born in that township. 3 years later, her father sold it. Michael Woods bought the 80 acres in November of 1842 for $250, and Henry Quiner walked away with $150 of profit on paper. And then the family stayed. They did not move out. Another son was born in Brookfield 2 years later, so the family was still in that township with the deed gone. Whether they paid rent to Michael Woods or came to some other arrangement, nobody wrote down. What the record shows is the shape of it. The deed goes. The family is still standing there. That is the first version of the pattern Caroline lived inside for the rest of her life. The deed goes first. The family goes later, when it has to. So what does a family do when it has sold the farm and cannot leave it? It waits. And what made them go, in the end, was the lake. Henry Quiner drowned. He had gone up the Lake Michigan shore on a trading run, the way men in that country did, and the boat did not come back. Caroline was 5, or near enough to it. Her mother was left with 6 children and no husband and no farm. I want to be careful here, because the exact date of that drowning is one of those places where the records disagree with each other, and I would rather tell you that plainly than pretend to a precision nobody has. What is not in doubt is the outcome. In the winter of 1845, Charlotte Quiner was a widow with 6 children in Wisconsin. What she did next is the single most extraordinary document in Caroline's childhood, and almost nobody mentions it. On the 7th of February 1848, Charlotte Quiner bought 40 acres of federal land in Concord Township. Not her brother, not a trustee, her, in her own name, 27 months after her husband drowned. $50. $1.25 an acre, the cheapest legal ground in America, paid by a widow with 6 children and no man on the paper anywhere. It was a great deal harder for a married woman to hold land in her own name in 1848. Her husband's name generally went where hers would have gone. It was precisely because Charlotte had no husband that the deed could say Charlotte. So that is the house Caroline grew up in. 40 acres bought by her mother, held by her mother, worked by her mother, and by whichever children were tall enough that season. She had a stepfather eventually, Frederick Holbrook, and he was by every account a decent man. But the ground underneath the family was her mother's ground. Caroline was educated on it too. She had schooling, real schooling for a farm girl on the edge of the woods, and she taught school herself before she married. That is worth a moment, because it is the one asset she brought into the marriage that nobody could sell at a sheriff's auction. We have the contract. October of 1858. A school at Concord. 3 months, $10 a month. $10 a month for 3 months. At 18 years old. $30, and it is the only money Caroline Quiner is recorded as earning in her whole life. But she could read and write and cipher and hold a room full of children of every age at once, and none of that depended on land. 25 years later, when her eldest daughter went blind, that was the household the girl went blind into. Not a household that could pay for anything. A household where the mother had taught school and could teach at a kitchen table, and where reading aloud was ordinary. She carried all of that into the marriage with her. She walked out of that house on the 1st of February 1860 to be married. Did she know, at 20, what she was walking into? Nobody could have. But she knew what a widow with a deed could do, and she knew what a family without one looked like, and she had watched both from the inside before she was 10 years old. It is the only dwelling in her entire adult life that she left on a good day, by choice, with nothing going wrong. 11 months later, the sheriff sold her husband's farm. Now watch what happens to a family in that position, because this is the part the books have no room for. For roughly 2 years after the sheriff's sale, we do not know where Charles and Caroline Ingalls lived. That is not me being coy. Family letters put them in Concord Township into 1861, and then the record simply stops. No deed, no lease, no tax entry, no census, because the census had just been taken and the next one was 9 years off. Somewhere in Jefferson County, there was a roof over a young couple who had lost everything, and no piece of paper anywhere says whose roof it was. Rented rooms, most likely, or another relative's spare room, the way they had been in Lansford's house. There is no way to know, and I am not going to invent it for you. Does it matter? A gap of 2 years in a life of 84. I think it does, because of what fills it in every version you have ever read. In the books that stretch does not exist at all. The family goes from Wisconsin to Wisconsin without a bad year in between. What I will tell you is that those are the poorest documented 2 years of Caroline Ingalls' adult life, and that she came out the other side of them pregnant with her first child and about to leave the county for good. Then they surface again. It is the autumn of 1863, and what surfaces is a federal draft enrollment, of all things, which lists Charles Ingalls and his brother-in-law Henry Quiner in Pepin County, having previously been enrolled in Jefferson County. The Civil War was 3 years old, and the government was counting men. That count is how we know the year the family moved, and they did not move alone. Henry Odin Quiner was Caroline's older brother. 4 years before this, he had married Polly Ingalls, who was Charles's sister. 2 Quiners married to 2 Ingalls', 2 households, 4 adults, 1 bloodline knotted twice over. In the fall of 1863, those 2 men bought 160 acres of hardwood forest in Pepin Township together for $335, $2.09 an acre. They split it down the middle. The Quiners took the north 80, the Ingalls' took the south. And the year matters as much as the price. 1863 was the 3rd year of the Civil War. That draft enrollment I mentioned, the one that tells us they had moved, was not a courtesy. The federal government was counting men of military age so it could take them. Charles Ingalls was 27. Henry Quiner was 27 too, 3 weeks older than his brother-in-law. Both of them were written down in Pepin County as available. Neither of them was called. A great many men in that position were not, and a great many others paid a substitute or were passed over for one reason or another, and the enrollment lists are simply lists of who was there. So here is the picture. A young man and his brother-in-law, both of them just written down by a government at war as bodies it might need, spending everything they had on trees, 400 miles from the fighting, in a county that had been organized for 6 years. The Big Woods was not a frontier they conquered. It was as far from the war as 2 poor men could reasonably get, and it was cheap because it was covered in timber that had to come off before anything could be planted. That is not 2 pioneers striking out for the frontier. That is 2 families who could not afford a farm apiece, pooling what they had and cutting one in half. And how long does a thing like that hold? 4 years and 7 months, in this case. And on that south 80 acres, in a log house in the middle of the Big Woods, Caroline Ingalls had her first 2 daughters, Mary Amelia in January of 1865, Laura Elizabeth in February of 1867, 4 years and 7 months. That is how long she got in that house before the next move started. It was the longest she had ever kept a household anywhere, and she would not beat it for another 20 years. The house that comes down to us as the little house in the Big Woods was, in the paper, half of a shared purchase between a brother and a brother-in-law. The books do not mention the arithmetic. They do not have to. But I think you understand the house differently once you know that Caroline's brother lived through the trees on the other 80. They sold it on the 28th of April, 1868. Gustav Gustafsson bought Charles's 80 acres for $1,012.50. Both men sold on the same day, the same terms, to the same buyer. On paper it was a triumph. They had bought at $2.09 an acre and sold at better than 12. So how much of that $1,000 did he actually get? $100. The rest of it, the $912.50 that made the sale look like a fortune, he carried himself. He took Gustafsson's promise and held the mortgage on his own farm, which is a thing a man does when the buyer cannot get money anywhere else and the seller wants out badly enough to become the bank. He became the bank. So on the 28th of April, 1868, Caroline Ingalls left the only house she had ever kept for 5 years, with 2 small daughters, $100 in cash, and a piece of paper. 1 month later, they spent the paper. On the 28th of May, 1868, Charles Ingalls and Henry Quiner each bought 80 acres in Chariton County, Missouri. Neither of them had ever seen it. The seller, Adamantine Johnson, lived in St. Louis and dealt through his brother-in-law. The price was $900 for 80 acres, $11.25 an acre. They had just sold Wisconsin timber they had walked over for 4.5 years at $2.09 an acre. Now they were buying Missouri Prairie, sight unseen, for more than 5 times that. The down payment was $1. So what did they put down on 80 acres of Missouri? $1 down and 5 promissory notes at 10% interest, climbing as they went. $50 in the first year they fell due, then $100, then $150, then $250, and one more at the end. $900 in all. The surviving transcriptions of that schedule do not quite agree with one another on the last note. The total, the rate, and the dollar down are steady across all of them. I want you to hold on to that dollar. We are going to see it again, 44 years from now, in a completely different context, and when it comes back, it is going to mean something almost unbearable. Because that is the shape of this family's whole financial life, laid out in a single spring. Sell the thing you have for a piece of paper. Buy a thing you have not seen for $1 you can spare, and move the children. Caroline was 28 years old, Mary was 3, Laura was 1, and the wagon was pointed at a farm in Missouri that, as far as any record has ever shown, they may never have lived on at all. There is one more piece of paper from this stretch, and it is the one that tells you the most about how these two people actually operated. Somewhere in the second half of 1869, the family is in Chariton County, Missouri. We know they are there because on the 26th of August, in the town of Keatsville, Charles and Caroline Ingalls both appeared in person and executed a power of attorney. The document appointed Charles's father, Lansford Ingalls, back in Wisconsin, to handle their Pepin County real estate on their behalf. It was filed at Durand, Wisconsin, on the 1st of December that year. Read it slowly, and it stops being paperwork. They had sold the Wisconsin farm 16 months earlier. They were now living in Missouri, on land they had bought for $1 down. And they were standing in a Missouri courthouse arranging for somebody in Wisconsin to be able to act on the Wisconsin farm for them, in their absence, whenever it became necessary. Which means they already knew it might become necessary. Gustafsson was not going to keep up the payments. Whether they suspected that in August of 1869 or simply wanted a hand on the rope, the effect is the same. Before the Missouri notes came due, before the family had planted anything that mattered, before the next house was built at all, the door back to Wisconsin was being propped open. And Caroline signed it too. She did not have to be there. Under Missouri practice, a wife's separate acknowledgement mattered for real property, and so she went, and stood, and put her name where they told her to put it. That is the woman we are following. Not a passenger, a signatory. By the time the ink was dry at Durand, they were gone from Missouri. They had bought that 80 acres in May of 1868. They were still in Chariton County, in late August of 1869, And then, somewhere in the early autumn, the wagon went west again. And here is the part I had wrong when I started, and I want to correct it out loud, because it changes who these two people are. They did not simply skip out on the Missouri notes. On the 25th of February 1870, Charles and Caroline Ingalls appeared at Independence, Kansas, in front of a justice of the peace named Rowley, with 2 witnesses in the room, and formally cancelled the purchase. The land went back to Adamantine Johnson. The deed records them as residents of Montgomery County, Kansas. The first note was not due until that May. They handed it back before it came due. So it is not a man running from a debt. It is a couple who could count, standing up in front of an officer of the court to end a thing, rather than be ended by it. And Caroline is there again. Second document, second signature, second time she stood up in a strange county and put her name on the end of something. No house on that Missouri farm is described in any record. Not a cabin, not a soddy, not a room. 15 months of a family's life on 80 acres of land they had agreed to pay $900 for, and there is no dwelling in the file at all. Maybe they built and it went unrecorded. Maybe they never really settled, and the whole Missouri year was a wagon and a rented corner and a bad decision. The blank is real, and I am going to leave it blank. What we can say is where the wagon went, roughly 250 miles southwest, over the Kansas line into Montgomery County. And what they were going toward was land that cost $1.25 an acre. That is the whole reason. $11.25 an acre in Missouri against $1.25 an acre in Kansas. 9-1. A man who has just discovered he cannot pay $11 an acre will go a very long way to stand on ground that costs $1. There was only one difficulty with the plan, and it was not a small one. The land they were going to could not be bought. Not by them, not by anyone, not at any price. They were about to build a house on it anyway. The Osage Diminished Reserve was 4.8 million acres of eastern Kansas, and it belonged to the Osage Nation. Not loosely, not pending. It had been guaranteed by treaty in 1865, and that treaty said in plain terms that this ground was closed to preemption claims and closed to homestead settlement. There was no form to fill in, there was no fee to pay, there was no line to stand in. The land was legally incapable of being claimed by a white settler, and it had been for 4 years by the time the Ingalls wagon crossed the line. Charles Ingalls built a house on it anyway, out of timber that belonged to the Osages, in the autumn of 1869. Now, the version of this you know says he thought the government was about to open the country any day now. That is what Pa says in the book, and I think a lot of people, reading it at 9 years old, took it as an honest man's honest mistake. The geography makes that reading hard to hold. Only a strip about 3 miles wide along the eastern edge of Montgomery County lay outside the reserve. Charles Ingalls did not settle on that strip. He settled 13 miles out from Independence, well inside, on the southwest quarter of Section 36. One scholar who has spent years on this ground put it about as gently as it can be put. He can scarcely have believed in good faith that any land near him had been officially open to settlement. He knew, most of them knew, and there were a great many of them. When Montgomery County was organized in the summer of 1869, there were something like 600 white settlers in it. 14 months later, the census counted more than 7,600. The entire Osage Nation at that moment numbered under 4,500 people. So the picture the book gives you, of one lonely wagon out ahead of the world, is almost exactly backwards. The Ingalls family were not ahead of the crowd, they were the crowd. That is the ground Caroline Ingalls made a home on. And what does a woman do when the roof she is standing under is on land her husband knows he cannot keep? She unpacks. There is no other option in front of her, and the children have to eat. She was 29 when they got there, with 2 daughters, Mary 4 and Laura 2. She turned 30 in that cabin in December, and within a few weeks of unpacking, she was pregnant again. The house was 1 room, built of logs Charles cut on the reserve, with a hand dug well. Nobody wrote down its dimensions. Nobody drew it. Nobody photographed it. The cabin you have seen in photographs, the one visitors stand in front of, went up in 1977 on the strength of research done in the 1960s. And it is a reconstruction, an honest guess. Of the original house, there is nothing left but the well. And there is one contemporary government document that names this family in Kansas. 1. The census taker came through Rutland Township in the summer of 1870 and wrote them down as the 89th residents in the township. He spelled the name Ingalls. And when he came to the columns for what the household was worth, he put nothing under real estate and $200 under personal. $200 of personal property in 1870 is not a figure of speech. It is an inventory. Somebody stood in a doorway and estimated a wagon, a team or a yoke, a plough if there was one, a cook stove, which was the single most expensive object most farm families owned, and often the last thing sold, beds or bedsteads and ticks, a churn, a wash boiler, a few tools, a rifle, whatever crockery had survived 400 miles of road. That is everything Caroline Ingalls had at 30 years old. $200 of movable goods and a hole in the ground with water in it. The nothing under real estate was not the census taker's judgment of their poverty. It was the law. The households around them on that page were in exactly the same position because the ground they were all standing on could not legally be owned by any of them. A page of neighbors with no property line between them and a clerk with a column he could not fill. That is the whole government record of 18 months of a family's life. A misspelled line in a census, and the value of what they owned, which was $200 in movable property and no land at all, because there was no land they could legally be said to have. The third daughter was born there on Wednesday the 3rd of August 1870. They named her Caroline Celestia, after her mother, and called her Carrie. The record of that birth is a family Bible entry. Kansas did not begin registering births statewide until 1911, so the only document that says where Carrie Ingalls was born is a page the family kept themselves, later copied out for a researcher by Laura's daughter Rose. So what does the government know about the birth of Carrie Ingalls? There is a small oddity in the census as well. The 1870 count was supposed to record the country as it stood on the 1st of June. Carrie was born on the 3rd of August. She is in the household anyway, which means the enumerator came through late and wrote down what he actually found in front of him, newborn and all. It is the nearest thing to a look inside that room that anybody has. Then everyone in it got sick. The whole family came down with what people in that country called the fever and ague, chills that shook a grown man off his feet, then a fever, then a drenching sweat, then a day or two of feeling almost well, and then the whole thing again. It is malaria. Southeastern Kansas in 1870 was low, wet, freshly broken ground with standing water in it, and standing water is where the mosquitoes are. Nobody knew that. The connection between mosquitoes and malaria was 30 years off. What people believed was that the sickness came out of the air, overturned earth, which is why they called it malaria in the first place. Bad air. I have to be honest with you about the evidence here, because this is one of the most famous episodes in the whole series, and it rests on very little. There is no doctor's ledger, no bill, no letter, no notice in a newspaper. What we have is what Laura wrote down about it 60 years later, and a headstone. The headstone is in Mount Hope Cemetery in Independence, Kansas, and it belongs to a man named George Tan. In the novel, he arrives by chance. He is riding north toward Independence. He sees the house, he stops, and he finds a family too sick to stand. In the record, he lived less than a mile away. Dr. George Tan was a freeborn black man from Pennsylvania. His father, Bennett Tan, appears in the 1850 census of Lycoming County, a farmer of about 50 with $200 of real estate to his name, a wife called Dinah, and 5 children, of whom George was one, a farming family then. By 1860, George is in Danville with a wife Catherine and a small son, and by 1870, he is in Montgomery County, Kansas, doing exactly what the Ingalls family was doing there, standing on Osage land, hoping. So who was he, this man who came? He had no medical degree, and there is no record of him attending a medical school. He is described as a homeopath, as an eclectic practitioner who combined plant remedies with physical treatment, as a herbalist. He had worked selling herbal preparations. He was said to be very good at setting bones. He treated Osage people and white settlers both. He practiced for something close to 40 years. He turns up on an Indian census in the Cherokee Nation in 1890 and was still working in Indian Territory around 1900. He retired in 1902 and died at Wayside, Kansas in March of 1909. His stone reads, and I want to read it to you exactly as it stands, Dr. George Tan, a Negro doctor that doctored the Ingalls for malaria in 1870. 40 years of practice, 1 week of it on the stone. I will say one more thing about him, and then let it be. Laura Ingalls Wilder did describe him in her book, and the first thing she wrote about him was his colour. She has the child staring at him and unable to stop, and saying she would have been afraid of him if she had not liked him so much. That passage has troubled readers for 90 years, and it was at the centre of a national argument about her books not long ago. And here is the strange symmetry. The stone in Independence, cut by other people long after, does the same thing. It names his race in the first 4 words and his 40 years of practice in none of them. Whether he delivered carry is a question that gets asserted a great deal and rests on one sentence in Laura's handwritten manuscript, which says the black doctor was there and Mrs. Robertson and baby Carrie had come. That sentence puts him in the house. It does not say he caught the child, and it names a second person besides. A 3-year-old's memory written down 60 years afterward is not a delivery record, and I would rather leave you with the sentence than with a claim it does not make. What matters for tonight is simpler and harder. Caroline Ingalls had a newborn and malaria at the same time, on land she had no right to be on, 13 miles from a town, and the nearest help was a man a mile north who had no diploma and came anyway. They all lived. All 5 of them, and the baby. How close it was, nobody can say. Malaria in a household with an infant in it killed people routinely in 1870. This one did not. The difference may have been quinine, and may have been luck, and may have been the man from a mile north. And then in the spring of 1871 they packed the wagon and left. Here is where I have to take away the ending, you know, and I want to do it carefully, because the version in the book is one of the most emotionally effective endings in American children's literature, and it is not what happened. So here is the book. Word comes that the government is sending soldiers to put the settlers off the land. Pa will not be driven out by soldiers. He hitches up and goes on his own terms. There was no such order. No federal order ever removed white settlers from the Osage Diminished Reserve in Kansas in 1870 or in 1871. No settler on that reserve was militarily evicted. Researchers have gone looking for it specifically, and the absence at this point is not an absence of searching. There are 2 real things underneath the story, and both of them are the kind of thing that turns into a rumor on a prairie. The first is that soldiers genuinely did come to Montgomery County in February of 1870 under a special order. They came to keep the peace between the settlers and the Osages, not to move anybody off. The second is a notice issued that August by an army captain, warning intruders to quit the limits of the Indian Territory in the shortest possible time, and forbidding immigrants to enter, on penalty of removal by force. Those words are real. That document exists. It was about Cherokee land, south of the Kansas line, in a different jurisdiction, and when his men went in that September, the people there left willingly, and nobody used any force at all. Now imagine that reaching a cabin 13 miles from Independence, third hand, in a country full of squatters who all knew perfectly well what they were standing on. The soldiers are coming. That is how a true document becomes a false ending, and honestly, both versions tell you something true. The family really was on land they had no right to. Somebody really did write down the words removal by force. It just was not about them. So if the soldiers were not coming, what moved them? Money and a date. On the 15th of July 1870, Congress opened the former reserve to actual settlers, not by homestead. There was no 5 years and prove up on that ground. Cash only, $1.25 an acre, 160 acres maximum, payable within a year, with the proceeds going to the Osages. Clear title could first be had in June of 1871. $1.25 an acre, 160 acres, $200 in hand, inside 12 months. Charles Ingalls had just given a $900 Missouri contract back, rather than face the first note on it. The census had just recorded his entire worth as $200 in movable property, which is a wagon, a team, a plow, a stove, and the beds. To raise the cash, he would have had to sell most of what the family needed to live. And at exactly that moment, word came from Wisconsin that Gustav Gustafson could not pay either, which meant there was a house standing empty on the south 80 acres in Pepin County. Their house. Free and clear, no purchase price, no cash deadline, because the mortgage on it was already theirs. You can watch a man do the arithmetic across 2,000 miles. $200 he did not have for the Kansas ground, against a debt-free roof in Wisconsin that only cost the trip. They left in the spring of 1871. The land they were sitting on became legally available in June of 1871. They missed it by months. Nobody ever put a dollar value on that cabin, or the well, or the broken ground, or whatever was in the garden that spring, because Charles Ingalls had no title and therefore no legal interest for anyone to value. There was no sale, there was no compensation, there was no claim. The financial loss on the little house on the prairie is, in the record, exactly $0 and one house. And the Osages, who had been robbed of more than 100 horses in a single month that year, and whose graves were being dug up, and whose provisions were being taken, had already agreed to go. They had agreed in September. The consent was signed on the 10th of that month, 5 weeks after Carrie was born, and the main body of them left over the following winter's hunt for 1.5 million acres in Indian Territory. So whoever left that country first, it was not the Ingalls family. The ground itself went on being ground. It was surveyed in the spring of 1871. From that June, a man with $200 could put his name on 160 acres of it. A great many men did, and their grandchildren farmed it. Somebody bought the quarter section with the Ingalls well on it. Somebody plowed where the cabin had been, because that is what happens to a one-room log house that nobody is keeping up. It turned on $200 in cash inside 12 months. A man who has just handed a Missouri contract back across a table does not have $200 in cash. I have gone looking for a moment where somebody told him the figure. A letter, a notice, a land office clerk. There is nothing. We know what the statute said, and we know what he did, and the gap between those two facts is where the decision happened, and it is not written down anywhere. Caroline was 31. She had 3 daughters now. She had built a household on that floor and taken it apart again. She was going back to a house she had already left once, in a state she had already left once. There was nothing in the wagon that had not been in it on the way down. 62 years later, her daughter Laura, by then a famous writer of 66, drove out with her own daughter to find that cabin. They looked in Oklahoma. They were about 40 miles and 1 state line wrong, because the book Laura had already drafted said the family lived 40 miles from Independence, and 40 miles from Independence puts you across the border. She had misremembered the distance by roughly 3 times over, and then trusted her own page over her own childhood. They came home without finding it. I keep thinking about that drive, a grown woman looking for a house her mother made, holding a wrong map that she had drawn herself. The Wisconsin house took them back the way a house does when nobody else wants it. They were in Pepin County by May of 1871. Same 80 acres, same log walls, same trees. Caroline unpacked in a room she had packed up 3 years and 1 month earlier, and set up housekeeping in it for the second time. That is a strange thing to have happen to you, and I do not think we make enough of it. Most people who lose a house lose it once. She had left this one deliberately, at what looked like a profit, gone to 2 other states, had a child in one of them, nearly died in the other, and come back to the same door. And this time it was genuinely theirs. No payments, no notes. The mortgage they held on it had simply failed, and a failed mortgage hands the property back. For 2.5 years, that was the arrangement. Charles farmed. Caroline kept a log house and 3 girls in the middle of hardwood forest. Mary went from 6 to 8. Laura went from 4 to 6. Carrie went from 9 months old to 3 years. And then in October of 1873, they sold it again. Andrew Anderson paid $1,000 for the 80 acres. Now, hold the 2 sale prices side by side, because they say something the family probably never said out loud. In 1868, Gustafson had agreed to pay $1,012.50. In 1873, Anderson paid $1,000 even. 5 years, 2 moves, 3 states, a baby, a near-fatal illness, and the farm was worth $12.50 less than the last time they had walked out of it. But this time, the money was real. Anderson paid. So in the autumn of 1873, for the first time in her married life, Caroline Ingalls got into a wagon with $1,000 in the family. Not a promise. Not a note. Money. She was 33. She had 3 daughters and a husband who had now bought and let go of land in 3 states. $1,000 was more cash than that household is ever recorded holding at once again. They pointed west again, into Minnesota, and by the following spring, that $1,000 was going into the ground on the banks of a creek called Plum. It was gone inside 2 years, and I can show you the day it ran out, because he had to swear to it in front of a clerk. Everybody knows the dugout. A room dug back into a creek bank, sod built up at the front, a roof of poles and willow and turf, grass growing over the top of the house, so that a cow could walk across the family's ceiling. It is one of the most famous dwellings in American children's literature. A third of On the Banks of Plum Creek happens inside it. Generations of readers have furnished that room in their heads. The government file on that land does not mention a dugout at all. Not once. Not a line. The preemption papers describe a frame house in careful detail, because the law required a description, and the dugout that a third of a novel takes place in is simply not in the record of the claim it stood on, which means the most famous room of this woman's life is the one room the paper does not contain. Here is what actually happened on Plum Creek, in the order the government wrote it down. Charles Ingalls did not buy that land from anybody. There was no Norwegian named Hansen. There was no trade of 2 horses for a farm and a crop and a hole in a creek bank. That transaction is the novel's, and it is not in the file. What is in the file is a preemption. He swore settlement in late May of 1874 and filed his declaratory statement on the 26th of June for 172 acres and a fraction, the northwest quarter of Section 18, in Redwood County, Minnesota. The tract was open when he walked onto it. What we do have is the frame house and a date. 2 years later, when he made final proof, Charles Ingalls swore that he had lived in the frame house and made it his exclusive home from the 26th of June, 1874. That is about a month after he first settled on the tract. A man swearing to a land office does not shave that date. It is the hinge his whole claim turns on. So the timeline the paper supports is this. They arrive in the late spring. Somewhere in those first weeks, they are living in whatever was already on that creek bank, and by the 26th of June they are in a house he built. The researchers who work these files will tell you honestly that the family may have been in that dugout for the better part of a year, or a few weeks, or not at all. Nobody knows who dug it or when. The one dwelling on that land we can measure is the one the government made him describe. We know a surprising amount about that house because he had to describe it under oath. 20 feet by 24. 10 feet high, a good roof and a good floor. 5 doors, 3 windows. Sit in that for a moment, because it is the only dwelling in Caroline Ingalls' entire life that we can measure. Not the Wisconsin cabin, not the Kansas cabin, not the rooms in Iowa. This one we have in her husband's own sworn words, because the government required it. 20 by 24 is 480 square feet, 3 daughters, 2 parents, and the baby that was coming. 5 doors is a lot of doors for 480 square feet, which tells you it was partitioned, which tells you Caroline had more than one room to keep for the first time since Wisconsin. The lumber was milled, not cut by hand out of the creek bottom, which is a real difference in a country with no timber on it. And how long did that $1,000 from Andrew Anderson last? About 18 months. In the book, that house is built on credit against the coming wheat, and the debt is what makes the grasshoppers unbearable. I looked hard for that debt. There is no note, no lien, no lumber bill, no yard named anywhere. The credit against the crop is the novel's device, and it may well be true, and I cannot show it to you, so I am not going to pretend I can. What I can show you is the date the trouble arrived. 19 days after Charles Ingalls filed his declaratory statement, on the 15th of July 1874, the Rocky Mountain locusts came into Redwood County from the south. 19 days. Whether that first summer's crop was taken or spared, nobody can say. One historian allows that a turn of the wind may have saved the family in 1874. What is certain is what the next 3 years did. The locusts had come to Minnesota the year before, and they would stay through 1877. In 1873, the losses ran to something over 500,000 bushels. In 1874, more than 2.5 million. In 1875, more than 2 million again. Across the whole plague, the figure has been put at over 5 million bushels of Minnesota wheat. Wheat was quoted at $1.02 a bushel in 1874. I want to stay with the insect for a minute, because most people picture something like a bad summer for the garden, and it was not that. The Rocky Mountain locust traveled in swarms that took days to pass. They came down on a wheat field and left the ground bare. Farmers reported them going after the wool on live sheep, and after the handles of tools where sweat had soaked into the wood. Farmers dug trenches and drove them in and burned them, and the trenches filled again. They laid their eggs in the packed earth of the fields and the roads. The eggs came through the winter and hatched in the spring on the same ground. A farmer who survived one season woke to the next one crawling. That insect no longer exists. Not endangered. Extinct. The last living Rocky Mountain locust anyone recorded was seen in the early years of the next century, and nobody has found one since. The thing that emptied 5 million bushels of Minnesota wheat is gone, and we are still not entirely sure why, and there is something almost unfair about that. So what does a state do when an insect eats its economy? Minnesota did not only pray about it, although it did pray. Governor John Pillsbury proclaimed Thursday the 26th of April 1877 a statewide day of prayer. That is the day that turns up in every retelling, usually attached to the wrong governor, and it is usually where the story stops, with a hard freeze arriving, and the plague breaking, and everyone going home from church. The legislature had been rather busier than that. In January of 1877, the state put $5,000 into direct relief. In February, it voted $75,000 more for seed grain, and here is how you got it. $25 a man, on a sworn affidavit, with the state taking a first lien on your crop. In other words, the state would feed your seed drill, and then the state stood first in line at your harvest. Then in March, the state put $100,000 into a bounty, $1 a bushel for locusts caught before the 25th of May, sliding down to 20 cents a bushel after, 50 cents a gallon for the eggs. A bushel of grasshoppers, People measured them by the bushel and carried them in and were paid. And in some counties, there was what they called the grasshopper draft, where able-bodied men could be called out to work on the destruction, the way you would be called out for a road or a levee. Men were drafted against grasshoppers. That is what the state of Minnesota was doing in the spring of 1877. And the reason I have told you all of it is that the Ingalls family got none of it. They were in Iowa by then. Charles Ingalls had signed his pauper's oath in November of 1875, sold his land at a loss in July of 1876, buried his son in August and gone east. The seed grain, the bounty, the banner harvest of 1877, all of it arrived in Redwood County after the wagon left. Whether he ever drew any Minnesota relief beyond those 2 half barrels of flour, nobody can say. There is no record of it either way. I cannot tell you what the Ingalls crop was worth in either year, because no bushel count and no dollar figure survives for their land specifically. What I can tell you is what the family did next, which is more eloquent than a number. In 1875, Charles Ingalls had 40 acres broken and cultivated. In June, he filed a second claim, a tree claim, on another 160 acres, which cost no purchase money at all under the law of the time, only the obligation to plant trees and keep them. Researchers did not even find that filing in the federal records until the year 2000, which is why the older books do not mention it. Then he sold his horses. He left the money from the horses with Caroline, and he walked about 200 miles east to find harvest work. The books and the television version give different distances for that walk, and the research puts it near 200 miles. The number matters less than the shape of it. He sold the animals that pulled the plow, gave the cash to his wife, and went east on foot, and she stayed on the claim with 3 daughters and a pregnancy. So what was she doing through all of that, on 40 broken acres with no horses and no husband, waiting to have a baby? He was born on the 1st of November, 1875. They named him Charles Frederick after his father and called him Freddie. He was Caroline's 5th child and her only son. 29 days later, on the 30th of November, 1875, Charles Ingalls stood in front of a clerk and signed a sworn statement that he was, in his own spelling, wholly without means. For that oath, he received 2 half barrels of flour, valued at $5.25. That is the day the $1,000 ran out. Not a bank record, not a foreclosure notice. A pauper's oath in a county office, 4 weeks after a son was born, from a man who 2 years earlier had walked out of Wisconsin with more money than he had ever held. $5.25 of flour for a household of 6. I have read a great many documents about this family, and that one stops me every time, because of what it took to sign it. He had been a landowner in 3 states, in a small county where the clerk knew his name. He put his hand on a paper that said he had nothing, so that there would be flour in the house. So what does a man do the winter after he has signed a paper saying he has nothing? He finishes buying the farm, and then he sells it. On Friday the 7th of July, 1876, Charles Ingalls completed the purchase of the Plum Creek land from the government. He paid $2.50 an acre, which was double the usual federal minimum, because the tract sat inside a railroad land grant, and railroad land cost twice as much. For 172 acres and a fraction, the bill came to $430.18. On Monday the 10th of July, 3 days later, he sold the whole thing to Abraham Keller. $400. $30.18 less than he had paid the government for it 72 hours earlier, before you count 2 years of labor, 40 broken acres, 5 doors and 3 windows, and the house he built with his hands. 3 days. He finished buying it on the Friday and sold it at a loss on the Monday. And here is the part that is nobody's fault and hurts anyway. The very next year, 1877, Redwood County had a banner crop. The plague broke. The locusts hatched, and cold rain killed enormous numbers of them, and the survivors flew north and were gone. Abraham Keller got the good years. The patent on that land, the piece of paper that says it is finally and forever yours, was issued in December of 1879. By then, Charles Ingalls had been off it for 3 years and was living in Dakota Territory. The government mailed the title to a farm he had already sold, at a loss to a man who had already had a banner harvest on it. Where do you go after a Friday and a Monday like that? East. The family went in August of 1876, in the wagon, toward Iowa. They stopped on the way with Charles's brother Peter, who was renting a farm near South Troy in Wabasha County. That is where Freddie died. He died on the 27th of August, 1876. He was 9 months and 26 days old. The county death register records him, and it spells him Fred Ingalls, and it gives the cause as diarrhea, spelled the way the clerk heard it. I want to say clearly what the record does and does not hold, because a good deal has been written about this baby that cannot be supported. There is a line that circulates constantly, attributed to Caroline, that everything would have been different if Freddie had lived. I could not find a source for it. Nobody has ever produced one. Some places attribute the same sentence to Laura instead. 2 attributions, no document. What does survive is in Laura's own handwriting, in the manuscript she wrote long before the novels, and it is a child's sentence about her brother getting worse instead of better. That is what we have. I would rather give you the real one than the beautiful one. The family Bible says he was buried at South Troy. The nearest cemetery to Zumbro Falls in 1876 was about 2 miles off. There is a rough limestone marker there now, found buried near some shrubbery about 50 years ago and stood up at the end of a row, and nobody can say with any confidence that it is his. Nobody can. So Caroline Ingalls buried her only son somewhere she could not afterward point to, and then got back in the wagon and went on to Iowa, because there was work there. There is no Freddie in any of the 8 novels she published in her lifetime. Not one line, not a name, not a grave, not a reference. Whatever else was cut for shape or for pace, he was cut entirely, and so was the year that followed. Burr Oak, Iowa, is a small town in the northeast corner of the state, and the Ingalls family spent roughly a year there, and it does not appear in the books at all. They went because a man named William Stedman had bought the Masters Hotel in October of 1876, together with the lower level of the saloon building next door, and asked Charles Ingalls to come and help him run it. So what was the job exactly? The family moved into a hotel, not as guests. They lived where they worked, in the rooms of a working hotel, with a saloon on the adjoining lower level, and the Stedman family in the same building. Caroline Ingalls had kept house in a log cabin in the big woods, and a squatter's cabin in Kansas, and a frame house on a preemption claim. Now she was keeping house inside somebody else's business. Strangers coming through the door all day, and a bar downstairs. They lasted the winter. What the arrangement was worth to them, nobody knows. There is no wage, no share, no contract, and no settlement anywhere in the record for Charles Ingalls at that hotel. Laura wrote, long afterward, that her father was somehow cheated out of his share of the earnings. That sentence exists in exactly one place, which is her own memoir, and no ledger or third party has ever confirmed it. I will say what can be said. Stedman himself did not keep the hotel long. He had bought it in October, and he sold it in May, about 7 months, to a man named McLaughlin, and then went out and bought an 80-acre farm in the next township. Whatever the hotel earned that winter, the man who owned it walked away with enough to buy land. The man who helped him run it walked away with a wife, 4 daughters, and 3 more moves inside 12 months. That is not proof of anything. It is simply the shape of the 2 households on either side of the same front desk. By spring they were out, into rented rooms above a grocery store. Then out of those, into a small rented brick house at the edge of town, in the trees, on the north side of Lansing Street. 3 dwellings in Burr Oak, 3 moves inside about a year, in a town they had come to for a job. Grace Pearl Ingalls was born in that brick house on the 23rd of May, 1877. Caroline was 37. It was her sixth child, and her last, and she had it in a rented house that no longer stands. The house belonged to Benjamin Bisbee. There were two Bisbee brothers in Burr Oak, and Laura's memoir calls one of them one of the richest men in town, which has led to the two of them getting mixed up ever since. The one who owned the brick house was Benjamin, and here is how the Ingalls family left Iowa. There is exactly one source for this, and it is Laura's handwritten manuscript, and I am going to give it to you as she wrote it, because it is the only witness there has ever been. The children were woken in the night, and there was the wagon standing by the door with the cover already on. Bisbee had refused to extend the rent and had said he would take the horses and sell them to cover it. Charles called him a rich old skinflint. Pamela Smith Hill, who edited that manuscript, identifies three kinds of debt behind it: doctor's bills, grocery bills, rent. Not one figure survives. Not the rent, not the arrears, not the doctor's bill. No suit was filed that anyone has found. No judgment, no attachment. So we cannot tell you what they owed. We can only tell you that a woman with a 3-month-old baby and 3 older daughters was in a covered wagon at her own door in the middle of the night, and that her eldest daughter remembered it for 60 years. There is something I have to say plainly here, about a quarter of the way through this woman's life, and it is not comfortable. We have been following Caroline Ingalls for 6 years now, from the dugout to the frame house to a grave in Wabasha County to a hotel in Iowa, and in all of that time we have not heard her voice once. No letter of hers survives from these years. No diary, no account, nothing she wrote down. Every single thing I have told you about this stretch reaches us through somebody else's paper, her husband's sworn statements to a land office, a county clerk's spelling of a dead baby's name, a newspaper item about her daughter being ill, a tax assessment, and a manuscript her second daughter wrote 50 years later, from memory, as a grown woman with a household of her own. That is not unusual, and it is not a scandal. It is what the record looks like for almost every farm wife in America in the 1870s. The documents that survive are the documents somebody official required. Nobody required Caroline Ingalls to write anything down. But it means something for how we listen tonight. When I say she packed a household in the dark in Burr Oak, I am telling you what her daughter remembered. When I say she kept house in 480 square feet with 5 doors, I am telling you what her husband swore to a clerk in order to keep the land. She is in the file the way a person is in a photograph of a room they have just left. You can see where she was by what is arranged. They went back to Walnut Grove, back to the same town they had left owing nothing, in Minnesota, where the land they used to own was now producing banner crops for Abraham Keller. Charles took work as the town butcher. He was elected Justice of the Peace, and the county paper recorded the vote at 38. He signed a surveyor's certificate. He was one of the first officers when the village incorporated. In January of 1879, he was paid $21.54, apparently in justice fees. He also filed another homestead claim in May of 1878, on 80 acres, and never proved up on it, and they rented. There is a flat sentence in the land research that I keep coming back to, and it goes against something Laura herself wrote. There is no legal record of Charles Ingalls owning any lot in or near Walnut Grove at any time. She remembered him buying a lot from William Masters and building on it. The county says otherwise. So the second Walnut Grove stay, 2 years of it, happens in a rented building nobody has ever identified. And that is the house Mary Ingalls went blind in. What does a family do when the eldest daughter loses her sight and there is no property in the family's name in the entire state? The local paper carried a small item on the 8th of May, 1879. Miss Mary Ingalls, daughter of C.P. Ingalls, of this place, has been quite ill for some time, but is thought to be slowly recovering. She did not recover. Over that summer, she lost her sight and never got it back. The manuscript describes sudden pain in her head, one side of her face pulled out of shape, and Caroline's own belief that her daughter had suffered a stroke. The doctors put it down to measles she had never properly got over. The published novel says scarlet fever. A modern medical reconstruction proposes a viral infection of the brain, and it is a proposal, carefully argued, not a proof. I am not going to litigate the diagnosis tonight, because it is not the thing that changed Caroline's life. This is. Her eldest daughter was 14 years old and blind, in a rented building in a town where the family owned nothing, in a state they had already failed in twice. And in June of that same year, Charles Ingalls went west again, alone, to work for a railroad. Caroline and the 4 girls came out to him by train in the first week of September, 1879. Think about what she was carrying onto that train. 4 daughters, one of them newly blind at 14, no house behind her and no house in front of her. A husband working as a timekeeper for a railroad grading camp in a county that did not exist yet. The county history of the day calls the job timekeeper and camp overseer. The word paymaster and the figure everybody quotes with it, $50 a month, come out of the novel rather than a payroll. No railroad ledger naming Charles Ingalls has ever been produced. What we do know is that housing came with the work, because that is how grading camps were run, and that is where the family lived for about 12 weeks. The camp broke up in the first week of December, when the graders stopped for the winter. The crews went home. The Ingalls family did not, because there was nowhere to go home to. What they did instead is one of the better arrangements Charles Ingalls ever made, and it is not the one in the book. In her own handwritten account, Laura says the railroad company hired her father to live in the surveyor's house over the winter and take care of the house and the tools left in the lean-to. He was not given the house. He was not lent it. He was employed to be in it. That building had gone up between May and September of 1879, put up by the Chicago and Northwestern, to a standard section house pattern, 2 stories, board and batten, with a lean-to on the side for equipment. It sat a few hundred feet south of the tracks, on the corner of another man's tree claim, and for 4 months, from December of 1879 to April of 1880, that railroad section house was the best dwelling Caroline Ingalls had lived in since Wisconsin. 2 floors. Built by a company with money, warm, tight, and paid for by somebody else. She kept house in it as an employee's wife, on a caretaking contract, with the company's tools stacked in the lean-to. While they were in it, 2 things happened in that house that had nothing to do with the railroad. On the 2nd of February 1880, the first congregational service in Smet was held in the Ingalls home. Not in a church, because there was no church, in the room where they were living. And that spring the committee that organized the county met there too. That same day, Charles Ingalls wrote a letter to a newspaper over in Brookings County. It ran on the 12th of February. He described the country around him as fine a country as can be found in the West, and reported that he had trapped wolves and foxes and coyotes through the winter. He was writing advertising. A man in a house he was being paid to caretake, in a town that was mostly stakes in the ground, telling readers 100 miles east that this was the place. I do not say that unkindly. Every new town in the West had men doing it, and a man with 5 mouths at the table and no land has every reason to want neighbors. But it is worth knowing that the pa who is always being described as running away from settlement spent that February writing to strangers to ask them to come. They moved out of the surveyor's house on the 3rd of April, 1880. Where they went was a building Charles had put up on a Smet town lot out of lumber, salvaged from the abandoned railroad shanties. He was among the very first people to build anything in that town. His obituary, 22 years later, would say he was the first to build a dwelling in this locality, and then point across the street at a different building of his, which by then had been moved twice. Even his own paper could not keep his houses straight. They were in it a few weeks, because in May they moved out to the homestead. He had filed on the 19th of February at the brand new land office in Brookings, on the northeast quarter of Section 3, Township 110 North, Range 56 West, in Kingsbury County. 157 acres and a quarter. The filing fees came to $16. and one detail in that filing tells you how thin the margin was. When he filed in Dakota, he had not yet relinquished the Minnesota homestead he had claimed in 1878 and never proved up. That Minnesota entry was not recorded as given up until December of 1880, more than a year after the family had settled in Dakota Territory. A man is allowed one homestead. For a good while, on paper, Charles Ingalls had two. The house he built on the Dakota claim was 14 feet by 20, with a roof that sloped only one way. Laura called it a half house, and that is exactly what it looks like when you draw it. Later there was an addition, 12 by 16. Later still there was a barn, 16 by 24. The barn was bigger than the original house. That is not a criticism of anybody. It is what a working claim looks like when the animals are the asset. But it is the physical fact of Caroline Ingalls' life in the spring of 1880, 2 parents and 4 daughters in a 14 by 20 shanty, and a larger building for the stock. So count with me, because this is the stretch where the moving stops being a story and becomes a rhythm. September, the railroad camp. December, the surveyor's house. April, the town building. May, the claim shanty. 4 dwellings in 9 months. And that October, the first blizzard came. Where does a family that has just moved 4 times in 9 months spend a winter like the one that followed? I am not going to retell the hard winter tonight, because it deserves its own night, and it has had one. But 3 things about it belong in this account of her houses, and they are things the novel does not tell you. The first is that the family did not spend it on the claim. They came back into town, into a second building Charles had put up on a different lot, finished by the 20th of July. 2 stories, a shop front below, sleeping rooms above, a lean-to on the side, and a chimney down the middle, dividing the ground floor into a front room and a back one. That is where they were from October to May, not the half house, a store building. The second thing is that they were not alone in it. George and Maggie Masters and their baby Arthur were living with the Ingalls family before the October blizzard closed the country, and the census taker that June had already written them into the household. 3 more people, one of them an infant, in a building the family was going to spend 113 days trapped inside. No train reached Smet between the 13th of January and the 6th of May, 1881. 113 days. Laura took the Masters family out of the long winter entirely, and she said so afterward in her own manuscript. She knew she had done it. The most famous starvation winter in American popular history is told with 3 of the people in the room removed, and the woman who removed them left a note admitting it. I find that more interesting than shocking. She was making a book, not a deposition. But if you have ever wondered why the winter in the novel feels so airless, part of the answer is that the real room was more crowded than the written one, and she chose the smaller number. And the third thing is the deed. That lot, the one the store building stood on, had been contracted from the railroad's town lot company in 1880 on a contract made by Charles. When the deed itself was finally issued, on the 2nd of October 1882, it was not made out to him. It was made out to Caroline Ingalls. That is the first piece of real property in this entire story with her name on it, and she was 42 years old. Nobody wrote down why. It happened in the middle of the shuttling years, with the family going out to the claim in the summer and back into town for the winter. And it is exactly the kind of thing a couple does when they have been sued once already and remember it. Whatever the reason, from October of 1882, there was a building in Smet, South Dakota, that belonged to a woman who had never once, in 42 years, owned the roof over her own head. For 3 winters they did this, out to the claim when the ground thawed, back into the store building when it did not. 1880 to 81, the hard winter. 1881 to 82, 1882 to 83. Then they stopped and stayed on the claim year-round, and the store building started earning instead. It became other people's rooms. A man named John Carroll rented it. The county held meetings in it. People voted in it. School meetings were held in it. and Charles Ingalls, who was one of the two justices of the peace chosen in the spring of 1880, held court in it, which means that for a few years, the building where the family had nearly starved was the room where the town did its business, and the family collected rent on it. And what was a building like that worth in a Dakota town that was 5 years old? In October of 1885, they sold it for $600. It had been assessed at $160 for tax. Somebody paid nearly 4 times the assessment, which is what happens when a town is growing and a building is on the main street. It was moved the following spring, turned to face a different street, and spent the rest of its life as a shoe shop and an insurance office. It came down in 1919. In December of 1884, Charles filed one more claim, a tree claim, on 160 acres 4 miles south. He gave it up on the 8th of June, 1885. 6 months. He held that ground for 6 months and let it go, and after that, he never filed on anything again. And then, finally, the homestead came through. The notice of intention ran in the Kingsbury County News on the 30th of April, 1886, which is what the law required, so that anyone with a competing claim could object. Nobody did. He made final proof on the 7th of May. One of his witnesses was Royal Wilder, whose younger brother Almanzo had married Laura the year before. The patent is dated the 11th of May, 1886. In his final proof, Charles Ingalls swore to what he had done with the place. 60 acres broken, 2,000 fruit trees planted, apples and plums, bearing small fruit in abundance. He put the total value of the whole homestead, land and house and barn and trees, at $1,000. Stay on the trees for a second, because 2,000 of them is not a hedge. 2,000 apple and plum trees on the open Dakota plain is a decade of somebody carrying water. That is a country where the wind comes across 100 miles of grass, and where the winter kills things that have no business being alive there, and he swore they were bearing small fruit in abundance by 1886. That is the one place in this entire paper trail where Charles Ingalls got exactly what he set out for, not the money, the orchard. He planted 2,000 trees on grass that had never grown a tree, and they took, and he wrote it down under oath in the year he finally owned the ground under them. 6 years later he sold it. Charles Ingalls was 50 years and 4 months old. That is the first time in his life he held clear title to a farm that nobody could take, not a preemption he had to buy at double rate, not a squatter's cabin on treaty land, not a mortgage he was carrying for a buyer who could not pay. A patent, signed, recorded, done. 25 years after the sheriff sold his father's farm out from under both of them. Caroline was 46. And what did she do about it? And the month after that patent came through, in June of 1886, Caroline Ingalls bought a town lot. Not Charles, Caroline. Lot 12, Block 10, in Brown's Addition, Smet, what is now 210 West 3rd Street. Nobody wrote down what she paid for it. That figure is not in the Memorial Society's material, it is not in the National Register file, and it is not in any biography I could reach. But the name on the purchase is hers, and the timing is not an accident. The month the farm finally became legally safe, she bought a piece of ground in town. I told you at the beginning that her mother did the same thing. In February of 1848, Charlotte Quiner, widowed 27 months, with 6 children, bought 40 acres of federal land in Concord Township for $50, in her own name, because there was no husband's name to put there instead. Caroline was 8 years old when that happened. She grew up on ground her mother had bought and her mother held, and 38 years later, at 46, in a different state, with a husband very much alive, she put her own name on a lot in town. I cannot prove she was thinking of her mother. Nobody left a letter about it, but the record is the record, and the record says that the only 2 pieces of ground in the whole of this family's paper that never got sold out from under anybody were bought by women in their own names. Charles built the house on it, starting the next year. Why him and not a hired crew? Because by then that was his trade. He was a carpenter by then. He had given up farming, or farming had given him up, and the work he did in Smet was town work, carpenter, justice of the peace, deputy sheriff for 6 years, tax collector, storekeeper, running a business called Ingalls and Company out of a building that belonged to Royal Wilder. For a stretch, he ran grocery wagons. A man who had spent 30 years trying to make land pay him ended up delivering groceries in the town he had helped stake out. I do not want to hurry past that list, because it is his last 15 years, and it is the answer to a question the books leave open. Justice of the Peace was an elected office, and he held it from the first spring the town had officers. Deputy sheriff he did for 6 years. Tax collector is a job a town gives to a man everyone knows and nobody minds opening the door to. Carpentry is a trade, and he was good at it, and half of early Smet went up under hammers like his. The store was the one that was his own. Ingalls and Company ran from late in 1891 through the summer of 1893, out of a building that belonged to Royal Wilder, the same Royal Wilder who had stood as a witness on his homestead proof. After that, he rented space in another man's building for about a year. And then the wagons. 6 or 7 ways of earning, none of them farming, all of them inside the same square mile. There is a version of this that reads as decline, and I do not think that is the right reading. A man who has been beaten by land 4 times in 4 states, and who has a wife and a blind daughter and a house that is not paid for, will take work, all the work. And the town kept giving it to him, year after year, which is its own kind of verdict on how he was regarded there. He just never got to do it from a farm. They moved into the house in December of 1887 while he was still building it. It started as 3 rooms and grew a room at a time, as the money and the weather and the hours allowed. By the end it had 5 bedrooms, 2 stories, 2 rectangles set at right angles to each other, double sash windows singly and in pairs, 1 brick chimney down the ridge, a lean-to on the back for coal. No concrete under it. It sits on 1/10 of an acre. There is no construction cost for that house. Not in the Memorial Society's records, not in the National Register nomination, not in any account anybody has published. Nobody knows what it cost to build. Which leaves a peculiar situation. The only price ever recorded for the house Caroline Ingalls spent the rest of her life in is a price from 1912, and we will get to it. 4 years after they moved in, the farm went. In April of 1891, Charles Ingalls took out a mortgage of $760 on the homestead. On the 18th of February 1892, he and Caroline both signed a warranty deed selling the whole quarter section to a man named George Elderkin for $1,200. The mortgage was cleared that May. $1,200, less $760, less the costs. Under $400. The researcher who has traced this family through every land office they ever walked into put it in one sentence that I am going to give you exactly, because I could not improve it and I would not want to. After more than 30 years of owning property and settling in 5 states and Dakota Territory, Charles Ingalls had less than $400 to show for his efforts. He did not die landless. He owned a house in town, but the self-supporting farm in the West, the thing every one of those wagons was pointed at, he never got. That is the whole of it, laid end to end. $460 for 40 acres in Wisconsin in 1857, gone to a sheriff in 1861. $100 cash for the big woods in 1868. $1 down in Missouri. $200 he could not raise in Kansas. $430.18 to the land office on Plum Creek on a Friday. $400 back on the Monday. $5.25 of flour on a pauper's oath. $16 of filing fees in Dakota. And at the end, under $400. There is one more move to tell, and it is not hers, and I think it is the reason the whole pattern is worth telling. Laura had married Almanzo Wilder in August of 1885, and they had gone out to his tree claim north of town. Inside 4 years the whole thing came apart. A daughter, in December of 1886, then diphtheria, in the winter that followed, which went through both of them and left Almanzo with a stroke he never fully came back from. Then a son, born in July of 1889, who lived 27 days. And then, 16 days after they buried him, their house burned. They lost the claim. They went to his family in Minnesota. They tried Florida for his health and lasted 10 months. They came back to Smet and rented, and Laura sewed, and Almanzo did what work a man with damaged legs could do. And in July of 1894, they left South Dakota for the Missouri Ozarks in a wagon with a 7-year-old girl, and Laura kept a diary of the trip. The diary says what they left with: $100 in a writing desk, $100 in cash, leaving a state. Her father had walked out of Wisconsin in 1868 with exactly that, $100 and a piece of paper, and Laura was a year old in the wagon. 26 years later, she was 27, and doing it herself, with her own child in the back, and the same amount of money. They very nearly lost that $100 in Mansfield. It went missing out of the desk, and for a night they thought they had come 650 miles for nothing, and then it turned up where it had slipped down. They bought the farm with it, and they stayed. Caroline was 54 when that wagon left Smet, and she had already made every one of those mistakes, and could not stop her daughter from making them again, because they were not really mistakes. They were what happened to people who had nothing but their hands and a horizon. Caroline stayed in the house. Charles Ingalls died in it at 3 p.m. on Sunday the 8th of June 1902. He was 66. It was his heart, after several weeks of being ill. They buried him from the Congregational Church on the Tuesday, with Masonic rites at the grave. She was 62, and she had been married to him for 42 years and 4 months, and in that time she had made a home under 17 roofs and been moved out of every one of them. She would live another 22 years, and she would not move again. How does a widow of 62, in a small prairie town in 1902, with no pension and a blind daughter at home, keep a house? She was not alone in the house. Mary was there, and Mary was 37 and blind, and had come home from the college for the blind in Iowa 13 years earlier and never left. And I want to stop on the college, because there is a story attached to it that almost everyone believes, including me until I went and looked. Mary Ingalls enrolled at the Iowa College for the Blind at Vinton on the 23rd of November, 1881. She was 16. It was a 7-year course. The way this is usually told, Laura went out to work at 15 so that her sister could go to school, and the money she earned is what put Mary on that train. There is a figure that goes with it that will make your teeth ache. 25 cents for a 12-hour day, basting shirts. That part is true. Laura did that work, and that is what it paid. What it did not pay for was the tuition. Dakota Territory covered the tuition, the room, the board, and the books for blind residents of the territory. That was the law. A family in Kingsbury County did not buy a place at Vinton because there was nothing to buy. The territory paid the school directly. What the family had to find was everything else: clothes for a young woman going away for years at a time, a trunk, the train fare, twice a year, across 2 states. Whatever she needed that the school did not supply. So the story is not wrong about what Laura did. It is wrong about what it bought, and the smaller version is somehow harder. She was not raising a tuition. She was raising the difference between a girl who could go and a girl who could not be sent decently. And what Mary got for it was not a rest home. The Vinton curriculum ran to 12 years and covered spelling and arithmetic and grammar and history and geography and physiology and philosophy and algebra and rhetoric and chemistry and zoology and botany and geometry and civil government and political economy. That was the academic side. There was raised print, and there was the point system for reading with the fingers. There was music, vocal and piano and organ and violin and guitar and flute and clarinet and cornet, and the older students practiced 2 hours every day. And there was an industrial department, because the school understood exactly what its graduates were walking into. Students learn brooms and mattresses and hammocks and cane seating and carpet weaving and piano tuning and sewing and knitting and beadwork and fly nets for horses. Every girl in that school spent an hour a day with the sewing teacher, most of them for 6 years. Mary Ingalls did well there. Her academic marks were high, and her music was better than most. In deportment, she scored a perfect 100, the highest of anyone in her class. That is either a compliment or the saddest possible sentence about a blind girl in an institution, and probably both. She graduated on the 12th of June 1889, one of 8, 5 women and 3 men. At the ceremony, she recited an essay of Robert Burns. The title of it was Bide a Wee and Dinner Weary, which in plain English is Wait a little and do not lose heart. Then she came home to Smet at 24 and did not leave again. So when I told you a moment ago that Mary sold fly nets and worked coloured string into the patterns, I want you to hear where the fly nets came from. They came from an industrial department in Vinton, Iowa, that taught blind students a trade because it knew nobody would employ them. She carried that skill home in 1889 and was still making them 30 years later in her mother's front room in a house on a lot her mother had bought. The two of them worked out how to keep it. They took in renters and became close to one of the families who rented from them. Mary made fly nets for horses and sold them, a woman with very little else to do all day and a great deal of skill in her hands. She played the organ at the church for years. And in 1919, the year Caroline turned 80, her youngest daughter Grace and Grace's husband Nate Dow moved in as well, to help with Mary and with her. So the last house filled up the way a house does, with the people who did not have anywhere better. And then, in 1912, at 72 years old, Caroline Ingalls did the last piece of business of her life. What do you do when you have 4 daughters and one of them cannot see? She sold the house to Mary. And what did she sell it for? The consideration recorded on that transfer is $1, plus love and affection. I told you we would see that dollar again. 44 years earlier, in May of 1868, her husband had put $1 down on 80 acres of Missouri he had never laid eyes on. He signed 5 notes he would never pay. Then he moved his family twice more before the first one came due. Now she was 72. Mary was 47, blind, unmarried, with no means of her own and no husband coming, and no children to take her in. Caroline had 4 daughters, and only one of them could not, under any circumstance she could foresee, house herself. A deed signed while you are alive does not go through a will. It does not wait for a probate court. It cannot be argued about by anybody after you are gone. It is simply, from that afternoon forward, hers. $1, plus love and affection, and the blind daughter owned the roof. That is what a woman who has lost 17 roofs does with the 18th. She lived 12 more years in it. Toward the end, she was not getting out much. The obituary says she had been feeble all winter, and that for the last few years she had not been able to get around to see people very much, or to go to church. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls died at 5 in the afternoon on Easter Sunday, the 20th of April, 1924, in the house on 3rd Street. She was 84. She had lived in it 36 years and 4 months. The notice in the paper gave the outline of her the way small-town papers did. Born in Wisconsin in December of 1839, married in 1860, survived by 4 daughters. Mary Ingalls, at home, Laura Wilder, of Missouri, Carrie Swansea, of Keystone, Grace Dow, of Smet. 4 daughters in 4 places, and one of them still under the same roof at 59 because she had nowhere else, and her mother had made sure of it. Here is her arithmetic, and then I will stop counting. 84 years, 6 children, one of them buried before his first birthday, 5 states and 1 territory, 2 rivers she crossed by wagon, with babies in the box, 18 roofs, 1 sheriff's sale, 11 months into a marriage, 1 squatter's cabin, 1 dugout, 1 hotel, 1 flight in the dark from a landlord, One railroad section house she was paid to sit in for a winter, and one shanty with a roof that sloped one way, and one store building where 113 days went by with no train, and one house on 1/10 of an acre that she bought the ground for herself at 46 and never left. I want to give you that number properly, because it is the answer to the question we started with. 36 years and 4 months is longer than every other dwelling of her adult life put together. Every cabin, every dugout, every rented room, every hotel corridor, every claim shanty, every winter in a store building, all of it added end to end, and this one house outlasted the whole sum. She was born in a cabin her father owned for 3 years and then rented back. She died in a house her daughter owned, on a lot she had bought herself. There is one more piece of the last house I want you to have, because it is easy to picture it as quiet, and it was not. For 22 years that house held a widow, a blind daughter, whatever renters were in the spare rooms, and in her last 5 years a fourth adult and her husband as well. Grace and Nate Dow moved in to help. One of the renting families became close friends. The census takers and the town knew it as the Ingalls place, and the two women in it made their money the way women without husbands made money in a small town in 1910, rooms and handwork, and the organ at church. Charles Ingalls had spent 30 years trying to make 160 acres pay. His widow and his blind daughter kept 1/10 of an acre paying for 22 years, with lodgers and horse nets and a church salary, and never once had to move. Grace and Nate moved in to look after Mary. Mary lived 4 more years and died on the 17th of October 1928 at her sister Carrie's house in Keystone, 300 miles west in the Black Hills, after a fall and a series of strokes. She was 63. They brought her back to Smet and buried her with the rest of them. The house went out of the family after that. What happens to a house like that once the family is finished with it? It changed hands. In the 1970s, somebody prepared a nomination, and on the 21st of April 1975, the Ingalls home on 3rd Street went on the National Register of Historic Places. The nomination names the owner at the time as a Mrs. Bessie Christiansen, who lived at 202 3rd Street, which is to say next door. 2 years later, a local society and a crew of volunteers put a proper foundation and a basement under it, which it had never had. 'Tis a museum now. People pay to walk through the rooms and stand where the stove was. And the surveyor's house, the railroad section house they were paid to caretake for 1 winter, is a museum too. You can trace what it was worth all the way along. $112.50 in 1893, $200 in 1902, $300 in 1913, $700 in 1945, $2,750 in 1947, and in August of 1967, $2,350, paid by a memorial society founded within weeks of Laura's death to buy back the house the family had once been hired to sit in. Almost every other roof in this story is gone. The Wisconsin cabin, gone. The Kansas cabin, gone, with a reconstruction standing near where it probably was. The dugout, fallen in. The frame house on Plum Creek, gone. The brick house in Burr Oak where Grace was born, gone. The claim shanty, gone. The store building of the hard winter, torn down in 1919. The first building Charles ever put up in Smet, moved twice and demolished in 1929. 2 are left, the one the railroad built and the one Caroline bought the ground for. And 1 hole in the ground in Kansas. The well Charles Ingalls dug by hand on the Osage Diminished Reserve in the autumn of 1869 is still there. Not the cabin, which is a 1977, guess standing near where the research says the real one probably was. The well. He went down through that ground with a shovel and a bucket, on land he had no right to, and it held water. It is the one thing his hands made in Kansas that is still doing what he made it to do. The house that gave the whole series its name is gone without a photograph, a plan, or a line of description written while it stood. What survives of it is a hole full of water and a book. They are all in the Smet cemetery now, on the edge of town. Charles, from 1902, Caroline, from 1924, Mary, brought back from the Black Hills in 1928, Grace, and Carrie in the 1940s. 4 daughters, 2 parents, in one plot, in the town that was the last place any of them moved to. It is the longest any of them ever stayed anywhere, and I say that without much cheer, but it is true, and after all those addresses, it counts for something that they are together. There is one Ingalls missing. Charles Frederick, 9 months and 26 days, is in Wabasha County, Minnesota, 400 miles east. He is in a cemetery near where a farm used to be. There is a rough limestone marker at the end of a row, which somebody found buried near a shrub about 50 years ago and stood up because it seemed like the decent thing to do. Nobody can say for certain it is his. So the only member of this family whose address we cannot give you is the one who never got to leave a house on his own feet. Everybody else was moved, he was left. There is one more thing I owe you, and it is about the shepherdess. You know the object, the little China woman who comes out of the packing and goes onto the shelf, and that is how you know a place has become a home. It is one of the loveliest devices in the whole series, and I have used it in my own head for years. It is not in the record. There is no China woman anywhere in the handwritten account Laura made before the novels. There is no shepherdess in the drafts her daughter edited. The figure appears in the published books, again and again, and the evidence points toward Rose as the source of most of it. Laura did write to correspondents that her sister Carrie had the shepherdess, and there is a small figure found among Carrie's things in Keystone and kept there under glass. The people who care for it treat it as the one. It may look more like a shepherd than a shepherdess. Nobody knows where it came from or what it is made of. The little figurines you can buy in gift shops are modern. They were made because of the books. So I am not going to tell you tonight that Caroline Ingalls carried a China woman through 18 houses and set her on a shelf in each one. I would like it to be true. The paper does not say it. So what is left if you take the shepherdess out? Here is what the paper does say, and I think it is better. In 1848, a widow in Wisconsin bought 40 acres in her own name because there was nobody else's name to use, and raised a daughter on it. In 1886, that daughter, 46 years old, 17 households into a marriage that had put her out of every one of them, bought 1/10 of an acre of Smet in her own name. In 1912, she signed it over to the child who could not see, for $1 and love and affection, so that whatever happened to anybody else, there would be a door that could not be closed against her. In 1924, she died in the front room of it on Easter Sunday at 5 in the afternoon, having not moved for 36 years. And in 1933, her second daughter, who was about to become one of the most famous writers in America, drove around Oklahoma looking for a house her mother had made in Kansas. She could not find it. She went home and wrote it down anyway. She got the state wrong. She got the distance wrong by 4 times over. She left out a brother and a year in Iowa and 3 people in the room during the worst winter of her life. But she got the thing itself right, and it took me a long time and a great many deeds to see it. She never wrote a book called The Ingalls Farm. She never wrote The Ingalls Family. She wrote a little house in the big woods, and a little house on the prairie, and the banks of a creek, and the shores of a lake, and a little town on the prairie. 5 titles you can stand inside. She named rooms, because rooms were what her mother made, over and over, in 5 states, out of whatever was standing when they got there. The farms all went. The claims all went. The money came to under $400. The rooms are what came down to us. You can let the day go now. The lamp gets carried to the last room, and the fire settles, and the house holds. Good night.